Good afternoon, everyone. Everybody's going to have a chance to ask questions, but I thought I'd get mine in first. Well,
Everybody gets a question?
How long do you have? First of all, I have to tell you that, as may not have escaped your attention, you have a huge fan following in Hong Kong.
The feeling is mutual.
I count myself as one of them. And I'll be honest with you, I'm a little starstruck, so I might stumble with words. So please bear with me as I get through this period. First, and I think I should mention to you before I start the questions that now, if you go to the peninsula, you can actually pay through your ANZ credit card. So you don't have to worry about the traveler's checks, which I'm sure you have and use, yes. Let me start with, I have very few questions, and then just for the audience, we're going to inflict upon Ms. Bishop a short lightning questions round, which hopefully will tell us a little bit more about her thinking around global politics and about herself. But before we get to the questions, just to kick it off, going from what was, I'm sure, an extremely hectic travel and work schedule as the Foreign Minister, as well as the Deputy Leader, to now on the backbench, has your view of Australian politics changed from the backbench?
Well, I certainly have a different perspective. In question time, I'm right up the back, so I do see things from perhaps a different angle. I am continuing to keep involved in foreign affairs. I have become part of the World Economic Forum Council, and I'm continuing to travel overseas, and being a backbencher actually gave me a window of opportunity to be here, so there are some real benefits. But of course I don't have access to the same level of government briefings as I did in the past. But having released our foreign policy white paper, I think that much of what we're seeing evolve in recent times was something that we predicted, that we anticipated. And so there have been no great surprises at present, but it's only been a few months since I was Foreign Minister. We are facing possibly one of the most contested and competitive times globally, and there are many significant issues that are unravelling, and I mentioned some of them in my remarks. But I think Australia is well placed to withstand the buffeting that the globe invariably delivers up to nations around the world.
So just on staying with that theme, because you mentioned some of the issues and you referred to them in the speech as well, around the dangers that are beginning to loom around what's happening in the global environment. And I know this is a bit of a daunting list, but I just put a few of them down. The strength of political institutions, the transatlantic relationship, obviously US and China, which you referred to, climate change, EU, NATO, the G20, WTO, Russia and its neighbors, Middle East or Asian regional power politics, and I'm not even going to mention things that you already referred to, which is Brexit and grey rhinos and international rule-based. These are all...
The Middle East, terrorism.
These are all trending negatively. And while each event in and of itself may not pose a global threat, but the combination of these trending negatively, how much does that worry you, and how imminent do you feel is a potential crisis looming?
It concerns me to this extent that we are looking for leadership at this time, and the old order that had managed such crises in the past is fraying. It hasn't disappeared, but it is fraying at the edges. And when the UN Security Council can rarely agree on issues, when the United States, under President Trump, is taking a rather unorthodox approach to US foreign policy, when Britain is consumed with the Brexit issue, when leaders around the world no longer have the popular support they once had, like Macron or Merkel, I fear that one of the biggest concerns we have is leadership. at this time. And while we have been in dire global circumstances in the past, there have always been the strong, focused leaders to take us through. I think that's lacking at present.
Do you think the world is looking for leaders in the wrong places?
Well, populism worries me immensely. That I understand that we have to come up with attractive policies so that we can get elected in democracies, but everything is too short term, and there's a tendency for populist leaders to win support because they promise what will, in the short term, be a popular outcome, but we all know long term will be detrimental. And that level of populism we're seeing in many countries around the world, and that I think is a concern.
Well, with that concern, and when you look at some of the countries around the region and possibly globally, and Australia is one of them, some of the Southeast Asian nations, etc., this balancing act between the US and China, which are the two emergent superpowers at this point, threading the needle in terms of how to maintain an amicable relationship and a productive relationship with both entities, as the US-China situation worsens, and assuming it does, even worse, how do you thread that needle? What advice would you give to countries as to how to thread that needle?
Well, just to pick up one point, they are not two emerging superpowers. The United States is the world's superpower, and we have lived in a unipolar world since the end of the Cold War. What we're seeing is an emerging global power in China, and history has shown that when an emerging power bumps up against an existing power, there are ramifications and consequences. What we must do is ensure that those consequences are peaceful. And as friends of China, as allies of the United States, it's incumbent upon us to press upon both the importance of the US and China working together. And that's why I'm quite hopeful that the threatened trade war, in fact, ends up in a very positive trade agreement between China and the US. Now, Australia is not the only country, by any means, grappling with this dilemma, exquisite dilemma. About 120 countries around the world count China as their number one trading partner.
That's right, yes.
The United States has a significant network of alliances around the world. So most significant countries are caught up in this in one way or another. And I just think it's going to take leadership. It's going to take some very honest and frank discussions and continuing discussions to build on the relationships that we have. And believe me, personal relationships matter a lot.
Yes.
In the field of foreign affairs, diplomacy and international relations. Personal relationships matter a great deal. So to build on those, work on those, and I think we'll steer our way through.
Yes, absolutely. I hope that we never have to make those kind of choices. Is it inevitable, Ms. Bishop, that the world becomes more protectionist as a fierce advocate of trade liberalization? What can we do to make...
We are seeing worrying strains of protectionism around the world and in some unexpected places. The United States is an obvious example, a champion of free trade over many years, but it was concerning to Australia that the US, having negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP-12, both candidates in the 2016 presidential election, both candidate Clinton and candidate Trump, argued for the withdrawal of the United States from the TPP. What I think is interesting is that the remaining 11 went ahead anyway and concluded the agreement without the United States when so many said that would not be possible. Even the opposition in Australia said we couldn't do it. And with the leadership of Prime Minister Abe in Japan, Prime Minister Turnbull from Australia, from Mexico, Singapore and others, we concluded that TPP-11, which is one of the highest quality, highest standard free trade agreements in the world. So we can resist protectionism, even in circumstances where it was the United States that pulled out of TPP.
Yeah.
Obviously, the WTO needs some reform, and it's not perfect, but we want to see free trade agreements that are WTO consistent and of a high standard. And I know Australia is advocating for positive and productive reforms of the WTO. The fact that the United States is threatening to withdraw from various institutions unless they do change, I think will be the impetus that is required.
So you're optimistic that we are not entering into an irreversible era of protectionism?
Not irreversible.
Great, thanks. Australia's relationship with China was obviously a key focus when you were Foreign Minister. What's your experience dealing with China? And lessons that you've learned personally that you might want to share with some of the businesses here who operate in China?
The Australia-China relationship is one of the most significant for our country, and the effort that we put into managing that relationship should never be underestimated. Again, personal relationships do count. I spent a lot of time with my Foreign Minister counterpart, Wang Yi, and we get along just fine. However, China respects strength, it does not respect weakness. And Australia must always stand up for its values and stand up for well-considered foreign policy. That doesn't always please China, and they make their displeasure known in various ways. But you couldn't have a closer relationship between two countries than the United States and Australia. And we disagree with the United States on issues from time to time. It's how you manage those differences that count. And I think Australia and China are still learning to manage our differences. We're very different countries, different systems of government, different cultural and society values. And I think it's important that we spend much more time understanding each other's perspective, spending time in each other's shoes so that we can manage the inevitable differences that will arise.
That's good advice. I totally agree. Now, speaking of cultures and working across cultures, Australia is obviously well known to be culturally accepting as a society. But we find that that's not necessarily reflected at the boardroom and at senior management levels, just as we're fighting the war on gender diversity. What advice would you give to Australian corporates in terms of creating more diversity at the senior levels, both culturally as well as from a gender standpoint? Top two things that you would advise any corporate.
Well, first, Australia is a multicultural society. Over decades, we have welcomed people from all over the world, and we now have generation after generation of Australians who were born overseas or have a parent living overseas or parent born overseas. So ours is a very diverse society. What we need to do is ensure that we make the effort to identify the talent that is undoubtedly there. And I find it's not about quotas, it's about actually doing it, identifying the people who, on merit, can add a richness to your boardroom. I mean, the evidence is there that the more diverse a board, the more likely it is to be a profitable company.
That's right.
And so we all worry about the bottom line, so I think that boards should take on board the evidence that is available to show what diversity around the boardroom table can mean in better decision making, better outcomes, more satisfied workforces, and how to be a role model for others. I think it's so obvious I shouldn't have to spell it out.
When I think you're in... And I think with your initiative with the new Colombo Plan, where you've had more than 40,000 Australians coming to live, study, work in Asia, I certainly hope that many of them, as they return back to Australia, are going to bring that broader perspective to senior levels in Australia.
Well, the new Colombo Plan was actually inspired by my overseas travel through Asia, inspired by the time that I spent studying overseas, and also by the original Colombo Plan from the 1950s, which saw thousands of young people from across Asia, studying in Australian universities, gaining qualifications and going back home after the Second World War and into the 50s, 60s and beyond. So the new Colombo Plan is in reverse. The government is sponsoring Australian undergraduates to undertake part of their studies, part of their bachelor degrees in a university in one of 38 locations across the Asia Pacific. And Australian students were not prone to studying overseas, and if they did, it was either in Europe or the United States. So this is the government saying, no, we want you to be more Asia literate, to have an understanding of the cultures, the languages, the people that are undoubtedly Australia's future. So from a standing start in 2014 and using Hong Kong as one of the 4 pilot destinations, thank you Hong Kong, we have now seen, by the end of this year, 40,000 young Australian undergraduates live, study and undertake work experience under the new Colombo Plan. And what a great asset they will be. The future leaders of our country will have, during their formative years, spent time living and learning overseas. And I want to thank the so many sponsors in the room today who are working with the Australian government to support the new Colombo Plan. Thank you for taking our students into your workplaces.
I have one last question before we do the lightning round, and being from an Australian bank, I can't help myself but ask this question. Your views on the Royal Commission? The report is due on Monday. Just your thoughts.
You're leading with your chin here, aren't you?
I'm dreading the answer, but yes, I'm.
The Royal Commission report will be made public on Monday after the close of the stock exchange, and everyone will be able to read for themselves the findings. The Royal Commission was called in part to increase consumer confidence in the banking sector. It has revealed some misconduct on the part of some sectors of the banking industry that should not be tolerated, and we can hope that as a result of the Royal Commission findings, we will see an end to this type of misconduct. Mind you, the government had already moved to put in place a number of measures to boost consumer confidence in the banking sector, but I think that the Royal Commission findings will be acted upon and will ensure that the Australian banking and financial sector continues to enjoy a reputation of one of the strongest and most stable in the world.
Well, I thank you for that, and I should say that at ANZ, and I'm sure at the other Australian banks, we're very determined to make sure that these don't happen again. It is critical for us and for our survival to win the trust of the public back again. So we are absolutely focused on it and totally aligned with that objective. Now, having done the ANZ advertising, let's get to the lightning questions. And we're going to keep these short, but I thought it'd be great for people to hear some of these. I'll keep the questions short. Brexit, hard Brexit or remain? Your view.
Somewhere in between. I think a hard Brexit is not good for the UK. Remain is off the agenda, and so they're going to have to keep negotiating. Of course, from Australia's point of view, we see huge opportunities with Britain out of the European Union, and hopefully a free trade agreement with the UK would be first on their agenda.
Okay, so somewhere in between. We don't know where, but somewhere in between. Okay. Now, we'll turn to some fun questions. If you had a theme song, what would that be?
I liked Shake It Off.
Good answer. If you were given the option to have a one-on-one dinner with these individuals, how would you rank them in terms of who would be your preferred dinner companion? Xi Jinping, Putin, Donald Trump, Kim Jong-un, or Scott Morrison?
Well, obviously, Scott Morrison is at the top of my list. Depends what kind of dinner I was looking for. From pure curiosity value, you'd have to sit down with Kim Jong-un, wouldn't you?
Fair, yes.
For entertainment, Donald Trump. For a very inscrutable evening, Xi Jinping. And for the scariest night of your life, Putin.
That's a fantastic answer. That's a fantastic answer. What's your personal hashtag that best defines you? Since we live in the world of social media.
Hashtag get on with it.
Ah, nice. Very nice. Very nice. Now, this is a general knowledge question. Name the big 4 banks in Australia. Actually, since Macquarie is sponsoring, we'll make it 5.
ANZ, NAB, Westpac, CommBank, Macquarie.
Fantastic. Now, I know you've answered this question for me separately, but which one is your favorite? Now, don't change your answer.
I would like to thank the sponsor of today's lunch, ANZ.
Thank you very much. Now,
And my personal bank is NAB, so don't take it.
for now, yeah. Who's a better dancer, Theresa May or Boris Johnson?
Boris. He's not a very good runner, though.
That's fair. Your favorite quote that you try to live by?
My favourite code,
Quote that you try to live by.
the one my mother always said to me, you go this way but once. In other words, make the most of every opportunity.
Very good. And speaking of your mother, whose advice do you listen to?
The advice from people whom I respect and whom I believe have my interests at heart and are not pursuing their own agenda. That does narrow it down, doesn't it?
We're looking at you, David. Yeah. Easy one. Which one is tougher? Being a foreign minister juggling diplomacy, or your backward leap into the deep ocean from the Wild Oats yacht on Boxing Day?
Oh, the backward leap every time. That was terrifying.
Front bench or back bench?
Is that a question or a statement?
It's a question that you can take whichever way you like.
I'm currently on the back bench.
I think a lot of people would like to know whether that might change.
You only get one question.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bishop. It's been a pleasure. And I'm sure there are many others who have questions for you. Thank you so much
Thank you, Farhan.
for being here with us.